Welcome, everybody. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. Thank you for coming. This was going to be a bigger panel originally, but people in the media are very busy. They couldn't make it to Aspen. So it's just the two of us, but we hope to be reasonably entertaining and enlightening. I'm Jeff Goldberg. I'm the editor of The Atlantic. This is Noah Oppenheim. He's the president of NBC News. He's a very important person. Please treat him with deference and respect. And we're supposed to talk about the entirety of the future of the media, which is sort of ridiculous, so we're not going to do that. I want to focus actually I told them I wanted to focus for an hour on the mechanics of streaming. I think people are totally fascinated by that. We're not going to do that either. We're going to talk a lot about, and we'll have time for questions so we can be directed by whatever you're interested in. But I want to talk about the media with a big asterisk. You can do the asterisk, or I can do the asterisk. You do the asterisk. Okay. The media and the specific challenges that people across the landscape are facing in what we refer to commonly as the post-truth environment or reality, echo chambers, alternate realities, and that sort of thing. Because we're all. Well, our two organizations, at least, are trying to reach national audiences. Our organizations, like many organizations, are built on the idea that there's a single America.
Yeah. For now, hopefully.
And that we're communicating a common reality, but that's one of the huge challenges that we're facing. I'll ask you this question. It's a question that I get all the time. I'm sure you get it. Everybody who runs something in our business gets this question. It's about a 6-year-old, 7-year-old question by now. So you have plenty of time to think about it. The question we get is, how do you, as members of the so-called MSM, the mainstream media, how do you reach across what is now safe to describe as almost a cognitive chasm to the 25, 30, 35, 40%, we don't know what the number is, the hard number is. How do you reach across the chasm to people who not only support Trump, but support or believe in a worldview that does not correspond to reality? Obviously, the key part of the belief system, a relatively new part of the belief system, is that the election in 2020 was stolen. But there's obviously many manifestations of this. So the question is, and this is for a leading television network and a leading news operation, how do you reach across that chasm, or do you bother even trying anymore?
So the easy part of that question is the do you bother trying, and the answer to that is, of course, yes. You bother trying for two reasons. One, because for an entity like NBC News, it is essential to our survival at scale that we reach a national audience. It's essential that we reach audiences across the ideological spectrum. It's essential that we reach audiences of various demographics. I'd say there's no challenge that I grapple with more than how to reach people in a variety of different categories. So let's start with the kind of big business challenge of this disaggregated landscape of social media platforms, Substack, mainstream media outlets like broadcast networks, cable news networks, streaming platforms, magazines. How do we reach audiences? So at NBC News, what we've done is we've made a really concerted effort to take our journalism, our crew of correspondents who fan out across the world doing incredible work, and we take their storytelling and we try to deliver it on the platforms where audiences are increasingly flocking. So we launched a product called Stay Tuned on Snapchat, and we reach 10 million Generation Z folks, younger folks, every single month, and growing. We launched NBC News Now, which we were joking about before, is a streaming platform. We won't get into bit rates and how people consume streaming platforms, but a lot of folks are not getting their news via a traditional television cable subscription. They're getting it on their phones, online. And so, this past Tuesday, when you had this incredible testimony at the January 6th hearings, we had 2.5 million people tuning in on NBC News now, not on a cable channel, not on a broadcast network, but on a streaming platform that didn't exist a few years ago. So we're building all of these new distribution mechanisms for our storytelling. But then you run into the next hurdle, which is the one that you're getting to, which is probably the most interesting one, which is what do you do with people who deny the reality of what you're reporting, right? I mean, our job as journalists, I think you probably would share this view, is to try to present people with the best available version of the truth at any given time. And it's an iterative process, right? You don't necessarily get it right on the first bounce, but our goal is to try to get it as right as possible and to continue correcting our work, acknowledging our mistakes, and working towards an increasingly accurate picture of the world around us. As you mentioned, there are 35% of the people in this country will tell pollsters that Joe Biden did not win the election in 2020. 20% of people in this country will tell pollsters that they believe that the events of January 6th were justified. I'm getting these stats from a great piece that you actually published this week by Ann Applebaum about the challenge of constructing a shared truth. When Fox News has been broadcasting the January 6 hearings, but we know now, based on ratings data, that as soon as they turn on those hearings, half their audience changes the channel. It goes, the audience just turns it off. They do not want to hear what is being said. How do you get them to hear it? How do we all overcome that challenge? I don't know the answer to that question. If I did, I would be doing it every single day. I know that there are folks at the margin who are listening, right? So if there are 1.7 million people watching Fox News at noon, and half of them turn the channel when the Hutchinson testimony begins, that still means there are 700,000 daytime Fox News viewers who are paying attention. And those people might be persuaded by what they're watching. So I think that there are folks on the margins of these filter bubbles, for lack of a better description, who we can get to. And I think the way to do it is, again, seeking out as many distribution outlets for our work as we can. And then the second way we do it is compelling storytelling. How do we present the information to folks in a way that is going to be engaging? We at NBC News recently published a body of work around a controversy that's going on in a school district in Southlake, Texas. So Southlake is a suburb of Dallas, very affluent school district. Like so many school districts in this country, it has been torn apart by the debate over critical race theory and how to teach the history of racism in America in schools, and how to give teachers and students training in diversity and inclusion. That could have been one article that just talked about people shouting at each other at a school district. And I imagine that article would not have changed very many minds or been all that impactful in the larger body of articles about similar phenomenon happening across the country. We were fortunate that we had a couple incredibly talented journalists who worked for us, Antonia Hilton and Mike Hicksonbaugh, who instead, in part because they knew that community where Mike is from Texas, they spent time there getting to know the families, getting to know the kids, and rather than one article about another school district in America torn apart by critical race theory, they put together a series of articles, a 20-minute digital documentary, a multi-part narrative podcast that really kind of immersed you in that community and with those families and kids. And I think that no matter where you fell on the divide over how these issues should be taught in America's schools, anyone would have learned something from immersing themselves in that body of work. And I think that, again, the quality of the stories that we tell, I think, are going to play a big role in how effective we are at reaching people.
You hit an interesting point, and I want to come back to it. It's about complication versus simplicity. That everything in our society now seems to be conspiring against the idea that humans are complicated. And it's obviously hard, and the limitations of storytelling, whatever those limitations are, 4 minutes on television, 1,000 words in a newspaper, to actually convey the idea that people are driven by many different motivations. Some are good, some are bad, some are indifferent. And we should talk about it. But I want to go to a subject another subject that we also face. And Joe Kahn, the new editor of the New York Times, made an interesting statement last week. He said that, I'm boiling it down, but he said, in essence, look, we are we're a newspaper. We believe in telling all sides of a story. We're trying not to be partisan, but we are biased in favor of democracy. We have a bias in favor of all of the values that we thought of, at least, as traditional American values, and that until a certain point, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party shared. Do you, as the leader of a very large organization that is trying to reach into every corner of America, do you have a bias toward democracy, and how does that manifest? If you do, or are you a fascist? It's a
One of the two.
Everybody's complicated except him. It's a binary with him. But how would that manifest itself in your coverage? Obviously, one of the most challenging things we all face, and you face this because you have a lot of interview shows, is what do you do with people, including elected Republicans in this case, who you know are going to come on your show and lie? What do you do?
So there's a few questions there. So
yes.
I'll start with the easiest one, which is that NBC News is pro-democracy and is not a fascist. We are very pro-democracy. Now, the slightly more challenging question is how does that bias in favor of democracy manifest itself in our work? And what I would argue is that as with almost any bias, the best way to persuade our audience that democracy is the best form of government is that not to simply state it or not to make declarations of our support for democracy on stages like this or in public meetings, but to go ahead and have our correspondents, our journalists, our writers go out and tell the story of how democratic societies flourish and totalitarian societies don't. I think the art of persuasion is to illustrate for people why your point is correct, not to say it louder than the other party, but to hopefully provide some evidence. So if we want this country to continue to be a democracy, we have to keep shining a light on how democratic institutions preserve freedom and liberty and lead to greater economic prosperity and the fulfillment of human potential. And we've got to go out and tell those stories in a compelling way. We can't just issue headlines or make proclamations of our support for democracy. It's got to be embedded in our work in a slightly different way. As for what we do with Republicans, and I think it's an interesting question I'd love to throw back to you as well in terms of how do you choose which voices you publish and you platform. It's very simple. The Republican Party is the other major party in this country, aside from the Democratic Party. Half the country tends to vote for Republican candidates. What those public officials who belong to the Republican Party say and what they believe is inherently newsworthy. It is important that people understand what members of the United States Senate believe, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. It is our job not to platform people or give them airtime and then not provide any context around that. If people want opinion without context, they can read Twitter all day long. Our job is to, of course, fact check in real time, surround those public official statements with reporting and context, but to ignore that they exist, and this I push back very hard on, because we will get, if we'll put a Republican senator on Meet the Press, for instance, and we'll get flooded with email and feedback. How dare you? Why are you putting this guy on? He's lying about the election. He's lying about this and that. He's a United States senator, and we're not going to let him come on and say things that we know to be factually untrue. We're going to do our best to correct that in real time or immediately afterwards. But to ignore the fact that he is a public official who holds high office and believes these things, I think is also a dereliction.
But have you ever said, you know what? We can't put Kellyanne Conway on or Rudy Giuliani on because we know that they're going to actively lie, and so there's real fact checking, real-time fact checking, but it's not really real time because first they speak and then you come in and say, oh, by the way, she was just lying.
Yeah, well,
how do you? I mean,
it's not instantaneous.
The mechanics are difficult here.
The mechanics are difficult, but and again, if somebody is, I think it depends on what position that person holds in our public life, right? Putting Kellyanne Conway on TV when she is an official spokeswoman for the sitting president of the United States is one calculation. Putting Kellyanne Conway on TV when she's a former spokeswoman for a now former president of the United States is another calculation. And I would argue, again, when these folks are representing the public office holders who are running our country, to simply ignore their perspective, to simply say you don't have access to our audience. First of all, I think it's an overstatement of our power as gatekeepers, right? I mean, maybe 50 years ago, in a world of 3 broadcast networks, a decision like that would have had an impact. But it's not like if we chose not to engage with these folks, their voices wouldn't be out in the world. Their voices would just be out in the world without the benefit of any of that fact-checking and context, because they would simply seek out the friendlier audiences that are not going to ask them the tough follow-up questions and challenge their worldview. So I would rather our journalists interviewing these folks any day of the week than simply ignoring them and letting them go on other platforms where they're not going to face any kind of challenge to their perspective.
But this is just my opinion, obviously, but it seems like across our industry, and again, there's no one media, obviously, but it seems like we've been on the back foot for 5 or 6 years. I mean, and I will talk about my own experience in this. You know, in 15, 16, we would use language like Donald Trump, comma, in a racially charged speech, comma, said that Mexicans are rapists, whatever the horror of the moment was.
Right.
And then eventually you kind of think, stop saying racially charged or infused with racial whatever. It's racist. He's a racist. But everything is so new in this in this political arena and in this reality arena because until 2015 and 2016, again, my opinion as the Atlantic, I am not saying that this is the NBC position, God knows. But until that, we had 2 parties that were tethered to the same norms, right? And this is not, and believe me, we're not up here to defend the Democratic Party or any party, but one party is substantially different right now. Large swaths of the Republican Party are essentially an authoritarian cult at this point in the history. Maybe it'll get better, maybe it'll get worse, we don't know. But and I just want to press you on this a little bit more, in part because I'm trying to figure this out myself. What do you do when American political norms have fundamentally changed? We still act, again, going back to this point, if you're going to put them on TV and challenge them, in the same way that Meet the Press has challenged people for 50, 60 years, however old it is. But you're dealing with a different species of political performance art.
Yes.
Because these people, I think, and you and I both know a lot of people who, in my mind, again, me speaking plainly, not him, were formerly sane and are now insane. And Lindsey Graham is in that category, and there's a lot of people we could all name who, formerly I understood and now I don't. How do you tell your listeners, your viewers, your readers, that this is new and we're outside any known American experience?
Well, I think you tell them this is new, and we're outside.
But do you? I mean, but do you feel like we're on the right honesty track with our own listeners?
I think that I think that you hit on a fundamental and key point, which is that this country has undergone a seismic transition into the great unknown, right? I mean, it's sort of one of those inflection points in history you could point to took place when Donald Trump came down that escalator. And what we've lived through for the past 7 years is a process, not just in media, not just in our business, but in a variety of industries and in the country as a whole, to make sense of how this is all going to shake out, where is this going? And I think we are in a better position to tackle it today than we were when it first began. I'll give you one example of an adjustment and a pivot that we've made. So in the lead up to the 2020 election, I cannot tell you how much time and energy we devoted to educating our audience over and over and over again about the reality that the election would not be called most likely on election night, right? So for however many decades, Americans had grown accustomed to the idea that at some point around 11 o'clock at night on election night, the anchors would come on the networks and they would declare a winner in the presidential race, and we'd all go to sleep knowing what the future looked like. We knew going into 2020 that there would be because of mail-in voting, because of a variety of factors, that there would be a lag time, and that we would be unlikely to be able to declare a winner that night, and that whoever lost, and certainly if the president lost, he had already signaled that he would do this, he would use that delay to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of the outcome. So, learning the lessons, hopefully, of the preceding 4 years, we did not wait for that calamity to befall us collectively, passively. We went out and actively tried to educate our audience about how this would work. We launched a vote watch unit and we deployed reporters, again, all over the country to tell the story of how voting was functioning in the various different states, how the certification process worked, how the count process worked, and we told those stories over and over again so that when Election Day came around and we didn't have a clear-cut winner called that night and doubts began to be cast upon the legitimacy of the outcome, people hopefully had that knowledge to be able to navigate that. When you're watching the hearings on our air, I think Lester Holt, others who are covering these hearings have not been shy about saying that the behavior being described and the tactics that were being considered to overturn the outcome of the election are unprecedented. According to almost every legal scholar, would have been illegal, unethical, unconstitutional. We're not afraid to sort of call these sorts of balls and strikes when they're that clear cut. How do we change this? How do we alter the course of the Republican Party, of the fate of the country? I don't know that that's the media's role per se, right? I mean, I don't know how you think about it, but again, our job is to reflect society, to help people try to make the best sense they can of what's going on around them. I don't know that we're the ones with the levers to pull that are going to somehow, persuade 35% of the country who hates elite institutions, who believes that they're being lied to all the time, who believe they've gotten the short end of the stick, that suddenly they should come back in the fold and start reading The Atlantic and believing everything they read.
I don't know the answer to that except to say that all we can do is tell the truth as best as possible in the plainest language possible. And by the way, do much more, we've talked about this, do much more exposure of the nodes of cynicism in that universe we've talked about Steve Bannon before, who believes that, that the philosophy is flood the zone with shit. That's his motto. You put so much crap into social media that no one can tell what's real and what's false anymore, and then it's a Stalinist concept, right? If everything is true, nothing is true, and if nothing is true, everything is true. And calling them out, but within the framework, you're right, within the framework of our power, he could do that. He has the freedom to do that, and we have the freedom to call him out.
I think calling them out is one part of it, but I'd love to ask you about another tactic that we can collectively use, which is The Atlantic published last year a piece by a woman named Jennifer Senor, which if you haven't read this piece, you should go home and read it today. She wrote a piece on the anniversary of 9/11, and it was about a lot of things, but it was a portrait of a man who lost his child in 9/11, but who had become a 9/11 truther, who believed that it was an inside job and had been kind of caught up in all of those conspiracies. And if I told you before you read it that you were going to read a piece about a 9/11 truther, but that you would come away from it with nothing but deep felt compassion for that person and a greater level of understanding for the pain in his life that had brought him to those conclusions, I think you would have react with some skepticism. You published that piece, it's extraordinary. To what extent do you think we need to do more, launch more pieces like that, do more work like that, do more exercises in sort of radical empathy for the folks that are believing these untruths?
I would say a couple of things about that piece. One is that you should read it. TheAtlantic.com. You find it on your telephones now. She just won the Pulitzer Prize for that piece. It was the greatest, one of the great. First of all, she's one of the best writers in America, so you have to have a skill set in order to go that deep and to be that clear about what you're talking about. But within the framework of what you're saying, yes, absolutely. But I would divide the world into two categories. Those people who are let's say, victims in some way of our new information environment, right? And victims of the cynical manipulation of information. And those who know better, the political elite, the political class that should know better. So I am absolutely in favor of, going back to this original point, humans are complicated, humans are scared. The opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is fear. And understanding what people are fearing is hugely important, and trying to illustrate in a 360-degree way why they're motivated to do certain things is obviously tremendously important. We all operate within strictures of time, money, space to do that. But you know, General Jim Mattis has a great expression that I always come back to. You know, he said the biggest national security threat in America is that the alienation of affection. We no longer have affection for each other, or a baseline understanding or affection. So yeah, that's hugely important if we want to keep the United States the United States. Where I would draw a line is them that know better. Right. Like, you're not gonna get me to. I do want to understand Lindsey Graham. I want to understand all of them, but I don't. The fear is that, you know, the old expression, to understand everything is to explain away everything, to excuse everything. There's a class of people who know better and who need to be pushed, and those are the powerful people, and they need to be pushed and challenged. And I'm perfectly happy not being overly complicated with them. But yeah, I definitely. I mean, I just had a little run-in with a Republican senator who didn't want to talk about some very obvious things because he's embarrassed by them or humiliated by them. But you know,
well, let's not blow. But what do you make of that kerfuffle and what that says about sort of the perception of the media's role and the relationship between the media and politicians?
Well, I mean, it was surprising only in the sense that someone who's, well, I guess this cuts both ways. There's someone who's 18 years in the Senate knows that reporters in a still-free America are going to ask questions he doesn't want to answer. On the other hand, if you spent 18 years in the Senate, you kind of get used to having your ass kissed, and you're a little bit surprised when you know you're shocked and offended when somebody asks you why you voted to acquit Donald Trump after the violent insurrection in the Capitol. But I mean, the specific answer there, and this kind of goes to this point that, and I have Lindsey Graham in my mind because I knew him pretty well. I knew him when he was the wingman to John McCain, and this is just a different person. And you know, I do want to understand him, but I actually mostly just want to press him on what I know he knows is wrong. And you know, with a senator like Portman, who knows better, who knows what Donald Trump is, but won't say it, like the only thing we can do is push hard because, and by the way, as a counterpoint to his unwillingness or inability to actually articulate why he stands by his vote to acquit, I would suggest that everybody go watch Liz Cheney's speech at the Reagan Library yesterday, where she basically talked about you can either be for Trump or for democracy, or for Trump or for the Constitution. And you know, one day there'll be monuments built to Liz Cheney, and I'm afraid that the 43 senators who voted to acquit Donald Trump after he led a violent insurrection, they're going to have a lot of explaining to do in the coming years. And my radical empathy ends at the line of power, put it that way.
Fair enough.
We can go to questions if you have. I mean, I know a lot of people do ask about streaming, and you know, but we have some mics that are going to go around. There's a question down here, if you don't mind. You could just wait for I'll come here, and then we'll go on that side. Just wait for the mic, if you don't mind. It's coming to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm just curious how you'll avoid letting Trump dominate the media in the next election cycle.
That's can I try? It's a good question, but it's like sort of asking, you know, how do you keep the weather from dominating the weather report? He's running for, you know, if he's running for president, he's running for president. There's nothing to be done. Like, I mean, this goes to your point. I mean, I'm
right. No, I mean, look, it speaks to, you know, is the media's role to sort of manipulate and shape society, or is the media's role to try to explain, understand, and reflect society? So if the Republican Party chooses to nominate Donald Trump for president, we're going to cover that, and it's going to be a dominant story. It's not going to be at the expense of covering the Democratic nominee, who presumably will be Joe Biden. But again, I don't see anything.
Wait. It's presumably going to be Joe Biden?
Well, he's out there. Well, he
Okay.
said he intends to run, so
Separate
take him
panel.
at his word.
Separate panel. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll meet here later and talk about that, because I'm interested.
But if the question is how does the media avoid being sort of distracted by the sensational or by pointing its camera always to the loudest voice in the room, I think that's a fair question and one that we're acutely aware of. I want to say one thing that on a slightly more positive note in terms of the shared reality. We talk a lot about voices at the extreme. We talk a lot about hyper-partisan platforms that take up a lot of oxygen. But there are still 3 evening newscasts in this country. Lester Holt anchors the nightly news on NBC. On our network, we get 7-8 million people 5 nights a week watching Lester Holt deliver old-fashioned, down-the-middle, nonpartisan, fact-based journalism. ABC has a similar number, slightly more, unfortunately, sometimes. CBS as well. And if you tally up the number of Americans watching those evening newscasts every night on the broadcast networks, it dwarfs by a factor of 7-8x the number of people who are watching the extreme voices on cable.
Can I just be pessimistic to your
Sure,
optimism
why
for a
not?
second? Yeah, that's fine. 30 million sensible people are watching sensible broadcasts. But we know, and I'm sorry to go like all the way dark, but we know how many people it takes to gun down a group of black shoppers in a Buffalo supermarket. We know how many people it takes to lead an insurrection in the Capitol. I mean, the problem is the extremes don't need a lot of people in order to upend the constitutional order, our sense of safety, our sense of Americanness. And so, I mean, it's a dilemma in that, and it kind of goes to your question. It's like, why do we pay attention to extremists? Because extremists, unfortunately, matter. And there is a question, like, if you actually cut them off, if you didn't cover them, would they still exist? I'm afraid yes. But
they would find ways to cut.
They'd find ways, yeah. There was a question back here somewhere. I can't see that well. Well, we'll come here because she has her hand up. Right down here, sorry. Whatever hand I see is the one. It's equity.
I love it, but is it kosher that a lot of your anchors are getting a little snarky and a little, how they feel? I love it because I'm an MSNBC junkie. And, is that a problem for you? You're not Lester Holt, who I have no idea what his politics are. I mean, I hope they're like mine. But
I'm not going to tell you one way or the other.
Do you find that?
Yeah. So I mean, I oversee and NBC News as a brand, and I understand it's sometimes confusing. NBC News is nightly news, the Today Show, Meet the Press, Dateline. That's our hard news brand. MSNBC, I don't have anything to do with. If our anchor is on NBC, if Lester or Savannah, if they're evidencing any bias or snark, that's a huge problem, and I don't think that they do for the most part. Do the voices on opinion and perspective programs on cable have more? I would say more than just snark. They're showing their cards pretty clearly. But as long as that's clearly labeled as such and there's no pretense of objectivity, then presumably an educated viewer can make a decision about how they feel about it.
Can we go back there for a second?
Hi, Noah.
And with a ringer.
As somebody who anchored an evening newscast, I think it's awesome.
This is known as a Marshall McLuhan moment.
Be nice, Katie. Be nice.
Yeah.
I think it's awesome that a lot of people still watch the evening news, but unfortunately, those people, as you can tell from the ads for Depends and pharmaceuticals and Preparation H, are all like 65 plus. So how are you going to get more people watching newscasts and news content that is more widely available? And obviously, I think 95% of people now get their news online. Yeah. So I know that's something you're thinking about. I came here late, so I didn't hear some of the earlier conversation. But let's face it, these are people who are on their way to the great beyond who are watching the evening news.
We're all on the way to the great
Yes.
beyond, Katie.
Not that there's anything wrong with 65-year-olds, by the way.
Well, I'd say a couple things. First of all, the average age for these partisan cable shows is older than the average age for the evening newscast. So, again, I'll be optimistic. I'll say, less people think that the future is with these extremists. I'm not sure it is. So there is an older audience across the board for cable and for broadcast. I mentioned it earlier. We have 10 million kids under the age of 18 watching the news presented on Snapchat on our platform. Stay tuned. I think I saw Gotti Schwartz in here before. Gotti is speaking, and his colleagues is speaking to 10 million young people a month, again, using the language of traditional journalism, nonpartisan journalism. That's hugely encouraging. NBC News has a TikTok account with 3 million plus followers. It's the biggest news brand on TikTok. It's growing every single week. That's hugely encouraging that many young people are seeking out our brand, which is a brand that stands for nonpartisan, fact-based journalism on those platforms. So, I'm more optimistic about young people and the kind of news that they want to consume. Now, you raise another point, which is social media and the Wild West of what kind of news and information they encounter out there that's being pumped out by more nefarious forces. That's a collective problem that we all have to deal with.
Yeah, I would just add to this. When I became editor 6 years ago, someone asked me what my Instagram strategy was. And I said, I did not know that I had to have one. But we have one, and we have one now, and we have 1 million plus people who see our. And the important thing is, and I think this goes to the question to some degree, it's the platform actually doesn't matter as much as the values that inform how you make your journalism. So our Instagram feed is fact-checked by the same fact-checking department that fact-checks our print magazine, which runs 10,000-word articles. And so if you have a set of values that you could hold on to, you could be platform agnostic and find people we haven't gone into TikTok yet. I know that we have to. But it'll be the same thing. You don't lower your standards because it's a different kind of platform. There was a question all the way back there. I think that gentleman with his hand up. Are you?
He's got someone with a mic.
We'll come there next. Okay, I'll come there next. You with the mic, and then you. Okay.
Hi. I know that both of your companies are funded by corporations. I heard an interesting discussion this morning on NPR. They were talking about how corporations have begun to push back on some of the social laws coming out, Disney in Florida, Roe v. Wade, things like that, and that they're becoming more socially enlightened, and yet they still contribute predominantly to the Republican Party. What do you guys think of that dichotomy?
All I can say is, we're proudly owned by Comcast, and I've never had anyone from Comcast weigh in any way, shape, or form on any of our editorial content. So I think the role of corporate ownership in media is overblown. It is not a factor in any of the decision making that goes on in my newsroom.
Just very quickly, my magazine is owned by something that has the word collective in its name, so it's not exactly a traditional model of media ownership, so I can't really go to that. But the same thing applies. The biggest single test, people obviously in a portion of the country don't believe this, but the biggest single test of whether it's a credible news organization is whether the owners stay out of the making of the product. And our owners stay out of the making of the product, and your owners stay out of the making of the product. Yes, sir.
All right, so I don't know how you go after Katie Couric. I don't know. I just don't know. I know my mom would be very happy, so we have to take a selfie. So just a hypothetical. Is it possible that we're living in a time where people are starting to realize that we actually never had a democracy? And the challenge in the search is, can we actually live in the place that we've always been talking about that we're in? It's like Langston Hughes said, right? America has to be the land that has never yet been, yet must be. There's an aspiration of what it is, which it clearly couldn't have been if you had segregation. It clearly couldn't have been if women can't vote. clearly couldn't have been if you've got 435 people representing 380 million people. So maybe that's what we're searching for right now. Just a question, just a thought.
Just a question. Just putting it out there, you know. But I'll let you go. I love questions like that so much. I could talk for 3 hours, so you're all in trouble. But you go first, and then I'll try to keep it. I'll try to keep it to like 1 minute and a half. But I love.
I think you should. I think you should write a piece for the Atlantic answering the question. I'll do the 30 seconds, which is that I think that you're absolutely right in that we're living through an era in which the cracks in that facade have become evident or have become evident in a way that is jarring and unsettling and scary for people. And we're finally staring at problems that were there all along, but that we can no longer ignore. And whether that's problems with our institutions, whether that's problems with, racism or and other forms of discrimination, yes, our heads can no longer be comfortably in the sand, and I think that that's part of what's fueling this social unrest.
Very quickly, to speak for my own organization, the Atlantic was founded in 1857 by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harry Beecher Stowe, Longfellow, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and so on, whole group of major thinkers and writers of the mid-19th century, to do two things: bring about an end to slavery and refine the American idea. First one is easy to understand. You publish abolitionist material and you argue for equality and freedom. The second one is harder to understand. It's the thing we've been trying to do ever since. The founders don't define the American idea. They just said you're supposed to be a conveyor belt for the American idea. But what I take that to mean, and what generations of previous editors of the Atlantic take that to mean, is that America is not based on blood or soil. It's based on a set of common ideas. Let's find what those common ideas are each generation. Let's refine them, with the notion that America is not perfect, but it is always capable of being a more perfect union. And through our journalism, we can help people understand how that more perfect union can come about. Obviously, a magazine like The Atlantic, in a time of national fracturing and anxiety, is, I think, more useful than in a time of complacency, right? And so I would hope that everybody across the media landscape is thinking about that. And I mean, that's just scratches the surface of an extremely deep question, but it's a great mission. We fulfill it, we try to fulfill it as best as we can as flawed humans. But I wish that more American institutions were thinking along those lines. A, that we're deeply imperfect, but B, that getting closer to perfection is the great sacred mission of all Americans. I don't know where, I can't even see. Where's the microphone? Can we go back there? I guess we have time for, why don't you make very, very quick question? We'll try to get one more on this side. I'm very sorry, but there's so many hands.
The quick question is, the Facebooks of the world referring to themselves as technology companies when I think they're media companies. What's your take on it?
I'll let you bash Facebook first.
What's that in the last Bond movie? What was the organization?
Spectre.
Spectre. Yeah, Spectre. You want to go?
We'll leave it there.
Okay. Was there something over? Oh yeah, here. Yeah, sorry, the mic was down here.
I didn't even know I was getting the mic. My perception in my lifetime is that the extreme voices have gotten more and more of the platform, and that's what has been on the news. And yet I'm wondering, where's the revolution of the moderates, like me and like so many people? And I wonder, in your positions, if you think that giving more of a platform to moderate voices, seeking them out, might have an impact in how individuals watching the news maybe identify or don't identify because of what they're hearing, and how could giving moderates more airtime be an influence?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, I'll go back and reference the stat I mentioned before, which is that I think it can feel that way, that the extremists have more of the airtime. But if you look at the actual data, the number of people who are engaging with what you would, I think, define as more moderate, middle-of-the-road content actually exceeds the number of people who engage with the more extremist content. So I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question, but if your point is that there are businesses that are built on the notion that if they serve red meat to a radical extreme every day, they can make a lot of money, you're absolutely correct. Those entities exist out there. I wake up every day, and the people at NBC News wake up every day with a very different mission in mind, and I'm encouraged, I'll again go back to the optimism, by the number of people that choose to engage with our brands across a variety of different platforms, particularly young people. So I'm more optimistic about it.
Very quickly, the issue here to me is psychological almost, or dispositional or characterological. Moderates behave moderately. That's why they're moderate. They're moderate people. They see complexity. They have self-doubt. They understand ambiguity and ambivalence. Fanatics behave fanatically, and it's very effective to be a fanatic because all you do is one thing. Your fanatical goal, right? And so by the very nature, centrists, compromisers, moderates are gonna be less effective in moving arguments quickly, right? And the other point is, and this has to do a little bit with the audience itself, not to push it back onto our collective audience, but people, and we now, because of all the ways we can track engagement across the internet, across television, we know what people read and what people don't read. And people don't read long stories about complicated solutions to difficult problems as much as they read, Steve Bannon said this or whatever, you know. And it's a problem. I mean, it's definitely a problem in across our industry. But it's also a problem of humans, you know, and the media is some flawed reflection of some collective human will in a lot of ways. And so it's an uphill challenge. But I'll close on this because it is a point that you're making. The truth is, if you add up all the people who watch MSNBC and Fox, and I'm not comparing the two necessarily, I'm just saying, but you know, are deeply engaged in a partisan way. It's a tiny minority of all Americans, you know, and so obviously one of the great missions is to engage the vast center left to center right in the great project of imagining what a more perfect union looks like going into this, you know, further into this century. And there are a lot of people who are working on this, and I think, you know, the press, our organizations have a role to play in at least setting the baseline of what a common shared reality is. The specific mission is to get more Americans to agree that this is the reality, what is being presented, with all of its flaws and all of its contingencies. And if we have a shared reality, then we can have that deeper conversation. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. We're over time. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you.
A lot of fun.